Hello all, Mr. Alper here with another lesson on grammar basics, the parts of speech. Today we're on to adjectives, those words that modify nouns, meaning they describe them, they enhance them, they add a little bit of shade of meaning to them. Basically, you can remember an adjective, figure out a word as an adjective, if you notice that it answers the questions which one, what kind, or how many. We'll go into a little more detail about that in a moment. Basically, adjectives are the words that modify nouns or noun phrases. So, first the definition. Adjectives are words or phrases that modify, which means to describe or limit or shade the meaning of a noun or a noun phrase. You can think of them as the crayons of the grammar world. They add color, they add shading. They don't take the place, nothing takes the place of good, precise nouns and verbs, but they can definitely enhance the descriptiveness of your writing if you choose them carefully. So adjectives, as I said, answer the questions, which one, what kind, and how many. Notice how many, by the way, the answer to that question would be a number. So numbers, if they're used in front of a noun, like 6 apples or 24 students, are adjectives helping define that noun in more detail. The most common kinds of adjectives, the ones that English is just littered with all over the place, are known as articles. Has nothing to do with articles in the newspaper. I don't even know why that term is used. But articles are just those tiny little adjectives that help us sort of point to a specific noun as being either specific or general. They include the two words a and the. A, when it's used before a word that starts with a vowel, is used in the form an, but they're basically the same word, just slightly different forms. And they're used to indicate if the following noun, the noun that comes after it, is either general, in which case we use a or an, or specific, in which case we use the. For example, if I run a lot of races, and I always reward myself with ice cream after each race. You could say after a race, meaning after any race, I reward myself with ice cream. But if we wanted to refer to one specific race, let's say I ran in the Boston Marathon last year, I wish, then we would specify the race. After the race, I rewarded myself with ice cream. Articles are kind of like demonstrative adjectives. It's another class that overlaps with them some. They're very similar. They don't really add a whole lot of meaning or description, but they generally point to the noun that they go in front of. So they're the same as the demonstrative pronouns for in English, this, that, these, and those. And they're used almost the same way. The only difference is when you use it as a pronoun, you're substituting the word this, in this case, for the word it represents. So in the sentence, this is delicious, the word this is standing in for whatever its antecedent is. We don't know yet in the sentence what it is. If you're demonstrating, if I were holding an apple in my hand and I said, this is delicious, I would need to say this apple. So this is a pronoun. But if I'm pointing to the apple or indicating through my words the apple I'm holding in my hand, I'd say, this apple is delicious. Whereas that one over there on the table is rotten. So then it's a demonstrative adjective. All adjectives can be used in the comparative and what's also known as the superlative sense. Comparative meaning simply it's used to compare the degree of one item in the list to another. Superlative just means, some of you know the word, which means the best of something. So the superlative degree is simply the furthest extent. If you're comparing 3 or more, the one that's all the way at one extreme or the other is the superlative. So in the comparative form, there are 2 ways of turning nouns into comparatives. The most common one is to add ER if it's a short 1-syllable or a couple of 2-syllable words. If the word ends, the adjective that you're adding the comparative ending to ends with E, you just add the letter R. If it's a longer word, if it's 3 or more syllables or some 2-syllable words, especially ones that have suffixes, you just add the word more in front of it. And In standard English, you should never use those two forms together. You can get away with it in everyday speech, in slang, if you're Shakespeare, because in Shakespeare's time it was acceptable to combine them. But in modern English, it's considered non-standard, kind of bad form. So with short words like soft and tall, you just add ER. Some two-syllable words like narrow or happy, you also form the comparative by adding ER. Notice happy, by the way, the Y at the end of happy is technically a suffix. That's the only suffix ending in common English adjectives that regularly forms the comparative just by adding ER to the end of it, like busy becomes busier, and so on. If it's a longer word, two syllables with a suffix like full, or a longer word than that, three or more syllables, generally you make the comparative form by just adding the word more. More peaceful, more important. You could say peacefuler. Some people would. It's not technically wrong. It's just kind of non-standard. But anything longer than that, you'd hear it sounds kind of weird to say importanter. And again, you should not use the two forms together. It's considered redundant. Some people will, just for effect. As I said, Shakespeare used to do it all the time. But I am more busier than ever would be considered non-standard. Instead, you would say, I am busier than ever, or I am more busy than ever. Even short adjectives that would usually form their comparative with ER can be made into comparative with using just the word more if it's called for. Sometimes you want to emphasize the word more in that sentence. Superlatives, as I said, are just like the comparative degrees. They just take it to the furthest extent. So if you're comparing three or more, one of them is at one extreme or the other. So you add the EST ending if it's a one-syllable word to make the superlative, or the word most in front of it if it's multisyllabic. And again, it's considered bad form, non-standard English to use them both together. So soft becomes softest, tall, tallest, narrow, narrowest, happy, happiest. And longer words, you just add most peaceful, most important. Edna is the most happiest child would be an example of redundancy. Most and happiest are both expressing the superlative degree, so that's considered bad form. Sorry, the animation didn't work there. That line is supposed to go right through those words. Edna is the happiest child, or Edna is the most happy child would both be acceptable. There are a few very common English adjectives that are irregular in the way in which they form comparative and superlative degrees. Good becomes better and best, and so does well. Bad becomes worse or worst. Far becomes farther and farthest, not farer and farthest. Many and much both become more or most, and little when you're talking about amount or volume rather than number or size becomes less and least. There's an illustration on the next page for that. So if you're talking about something that can't be counted, that can be counted rather, or refers to quantity rather than size, you would use less and least. Kia had little reason to complain, Roger had even less reason to complain, and Ernesto had least reason of all to complain. So compare it to when you use little to refer to size, where you just use little, littler, and littlest. And then there are a couple of very common English adjectives that are short, and so if they followed the pattern, they would add ER, but for some reason we don't. So you can actually, again, in sort of everyday usage, it's just considered non-standard for some reason, to say realer rather than more real, or righter rather than more right. So real becomes more real, right becomes more right, wrong, more wrong, most wrong, ill, more ill, most ill. Although, as I said, some of them, especially in everyday speech, you might form the comparative with ER or the superlative with EST. Illest, for example, has come into pretty common use, but it's still considered mostly slang. And any adjectives that come from verbs with what's known as a participle ending, an ing ending or a past tense ending added to the verb in order to make it usable as an adjective, those are called participles, Those also always, pretty much always, become comparative or superlative by adding the suffix. So the word boring, for example, is an adjective, but it comes from the verb to bore me. Baseball bores some people, so they find it a boring sport. Many people, however, find hockey even more boring, although it's pretty fast paced. But everybody agrees that curling is the most boring sport of all. Sorry if you're a curling fan. Tired wouldn't become tireder and tiredest. It becomes more tired and most tired, and lost, which comes from the verb to lose, would become more lost as a comparative and most lost as a superlative. So that's pretty much all I need you to know about adjectives. There's plenty more to know, but those are the basics, and that's all you need to know for our purposes, which means that adjectives answer the questions: which one, what kind, and how many. And if you can tell that those words or phrases are answering those questions, then you can usually recognize it as an adjective. Thanks for listening.